夏季优惠现正实施中。
Live Curious, National Geographic Channel.
And away we go. We're moving. They were the machines that made Britain great. Fast, revolutionary, and sometimes downright dangerous. These are the stories of our engineering masterpieces that shook the world and drive the way we live today. I'm in an engine-roaring decade of boom and bust. An age of empire that, when it started, saw petrol often sold in tins from the chemist. Yet by the time it ended, had fleets of tankers supplying thousands of garage forecourts. It was a time of great contrasts, when Britain's boffins created the largest flying machine the world had ever seen.
Yet relied on tiny pathfinding biplanes to map out the air routes we still use today.
And it was a time of great speed, when Britain's racing machines utterly dominated international motorsport, and her bikes could even take on aircraft with a chance of winning. Welcome to the high-octane decade that forged the petrol-centered world we live in today, but itself ended in the most massive economic collapse the world has ever known. Welcome to the 1920s. I'm at the epicenter of 1920s British motorsport, the site of the first British Grand Prix, numerous world speed records, and so many fatal accidents. It was said the medical facilities at this place consisted of a shovel. This is the wonderful, insanely fast banked circuit of Brooklands. A specially built 2 3/4 mile cauldron of speed, to which people poured throughout the 1920s to watch the drivers dicing with death up on the banking that loomed over everything. Whether you lived or died here depended on how you drove those towering walls. Turn a fraction too late and you'll fly over the top of the banking. But get it right, and the banking will slingshot you at great speed down towards the main straight. But these banks didn't just form a gladiatorial racing circuit. They'd also been specially built as a vehicle testing arena, where for 10 shillings an hour, manufacturers could come and develop their machines. Making this place the hub of 1920s British road car design, but also meaning the British road cars developed here were very much at home on the racing track. None more so than those created by the man whose fabulous car I'm driving today. His name was W.O. Bentley. A train and plane engineer whose move into vehicle manufacture had resulted in massive high-tech touring cars that the French had the cheek to dub les camions le plus vite, or the world's fastest lorries. But what lorries? Just look at this engine. For its time, it was absolutely cutting edge, reflecting Bentley's experience in designing engines for fighters. In there are revolutionary aluminium pistons, unlike most other cars of the day, but just like the aluminium pistons Bentley had designed and fitted to Britain's World War I fighter planes. transforming their performance and copied by aircraft the world over.
But it's not built like a plane engine, it's built like a train engine.
Meaning it went like stink and lasted forever. Like the rest of his machine. What you got of it? A massive girded frame to hold the engine and wheels, a steering wheel,
And a wooden box to sit on. And that was it. Bentley didn't do seats. Or bodywork.
You bought your car raw and had the comfy bodywork fitted elsewhere. The French might have sneered at them, but Bentley had the last laugh. In 1923, France announced a grueling 24-hour race, an extreme test of speed and endurance that has become an international motor racing classic, still run to the present day, and whose winners are lauded as the greats of world motorsport. Le Mans. Very first to enter was an ordinary British Bentley, driven by Bentley salesman John Duff, with WO's own test driver, Frank Clements, on board as mechanic. Unbelievably, I'm driving the priceless original 3-litre Bentley prototype that spawned their Le Mans car.
And what a fantastic privilege it is for me to drive the oldest Bentley in existence. Absolutely magnificent.
And just as Duff and Clements found, driving this car on a flat circuit like Le Mans, rather than on Brooklands banks, where it was developed, created its own problems.
Believe me, driving an early Bentley at speed on a flat circuit was, like everything else about the man and his cars, a game of utter contrasts.
On the straights, that massive high-tech engine made the car so fast it was practically unbeatable, blasting it along at a staggering 98 miles an hour.
But once it got to a flat bend, it was a completely different story.
Unlike the banked bends of Brooklands, which guided the cars round at massive speed with little braking,
With flat bends, you have to slow down a lot to get round them.
and the Bentleys were utterly useless at that, as they'd been developed for Brooklands with scarcely any brakes at all. All of which meant when Duff and Clements raced away from the start line in France, they were in for an interesting time.
Sure enough, the Bentley was faster than any of the other cars, sprang into the lead, and clocked the fastest lap of the entire race.
But as what brakes it had began to wear out, the Bentley struggled to make it round the bends, and it was overtaken by a slower car. As night fell, Duff and Clements raced on, now running second. They couldn't pit for more brakes, but like all the other runners, they had to stop every couple of hours to take on fuel.
And for refueling, just like today's Formula One teams, they had an ultra high-tech fuel rig. And this is it. What looks like an old milk churn full of petrol, and the biggest funnel you've ever seen.
As the sun came up, they were still running second, when disaster struck. A stone punctured their fuel tank, and they ran out of petrol miles from the pits. There was nothing for it. Duff ran the 3 miles back to the pits, where Clements was waiting. Clements borrowed a bicycle, lashed a churn of fuel onto it, and pedaled back to repair the car, with cork and a lump of soap.
In the end, they came in fourth. It wasn't a victory, but W.O. Bentley was completely hooked and described it as the best race he'd ever seen.
He and his drivers, the so-called Bentley boys, would be back throughout the 20s, this time with decent brakes. In 1924, they won by 10 miles. The Bentley's unique mix of speed and strength made it unbeatable over 24 hours. Now it could stop. They won again in 1927, 1928, and most spectacularly in 1929, when they were first, second, third and fourth.
Making Le Camion le plus vite, not just one of the greatest racing machines of the decade, but one of the greatest racing machines ever. I love it, absolutely love it. Today, having been privileged to drive two of the great vintage Bentleys. Oh, that's a timely moment. We probably need to give it a little bit of a pump there. Or do we? No, we don't. That is a timely moment, isn't it, really? It's still the greatest car of all time, believe me. But when you're 89 years old, you're entitled to conk out every now and then, I would have said. And that was probably my bad driving, actually, that did that, not the car.
Motor racing and the dashing Bentleys epitomised the 20s, a decade described by some as a 10-year party celebrating the end of World War I. Queens of the party were the flappers, young women who were cutting their hair short and their dresses shorter to embrace Britain's new craze for dance and jazz halls. The ex-soldiers were partying too, buying up as many newfangled boys' toys, gadgets and gizmos as they could get their hands on. And while the cities partied at their centres, they spread out at their edges, building comfortable new suburbs for the returning troops. So-called homes fit for heroes that came complete with lawns. Lawns had become a national obsession following Britain's invention of the mower 90 years previously. So when ATCO came up with their own must-have gadget in 1921, the first affordable motorised machine for cutting your grass, gadget-loving Britain went mad for it. The ATCO Standard. And you know, I think men love mowers, particularly British men, because of course that's where it all started. You can get up in the morning and see a really messy garden out there, and then you can get in the shed, get out your ATCO, fire it up, and then within an hour, depending on the size of your lawn, you've got a nice, beautiful striped lawn. Instant results. That's what it's all about. Instant results. Because, of course, the ladies love a straight. But what made the ATCO a great British mower, probably the greatest mower of all time, was that not only was it well made, it was also cleverly made. The engine, roller and blades were simply sandwiched between two steel plates and held together with just a few bolts, meaning it could be knocked out for as little as £20, a month's average wages, rather than the year's wages its massively complicated predecessors cost. It sold by the millions, set the shape of mowers to come, and made Britain a world leader. It even came delivered by specially adapted sidecar, which was nice. In fact, most things in the 20s were delivered by sidecar. There were even sidecars specially adapted for delivering motorbikes. However, if you were buying something really big, like a locomotive, it'd be delivered by Britain's first articulated lorries, made by Britain's mould-breaking truck manufacturers, Scammell.
当数以百万计的人看到这难以想象的景象摊开在眼前时，有一个人独自站在风暴的中心。前美国总统布希首度将他个人对911事件每一个片刻做出完整的描述。在91110周年纪念，国家地理频道独家专访前美国总统布希。91110周年纪念，小布希独家专访，星期四晚上8点，国家地理频道。
Infinity FX. Infinity FX V-Spec launch.
中华电信网内免费自由选，通话量大就加入自由打，网内通通免费。情侣哈拉就选我的热线，打2000分钟热线免费，全部免绑约，享受自由。门槛低，免搭上网费率，新旧客户都可办，免费打选中华，超自由。
行动触动真感动 ，Keep in touch。
中华电信，
请听，开启我们的视野。请听，给我们力量。请听，可以改变一切。英国宝城人寿。
L'origine de ce projet, c'est ma passion très forte d'exploration sous-marine dans la région du pôle Nord. C'est un monde qui est totalement fascinant, très fragile, en voie de disparition et qui était complètement inconnu. L'objectif était de ramener un témoignage sur l'univers sous-marin de la banquise et de le montrer dans sa diversité. À quoi ça ressemble, est-ce qu'il y a de la lumière, est-ce que c'est profond. J'ai écrit et dirigé l'expédition Deep Sea Under the Pole. On était 8 avec mon chien, un husky sibérien. J'ai fait cette expédition par goût pour la connaissance scientifique, par volonté de partager ce qu'on a pu observer. Au cours des 47 jours, on a réalisé 51 plongées d'exploration. C'est un monde qui est unique. On a peut-être poussé une porte qui ouvre un nouveau domaine d'exploration. On va pouvoir aller plus loin dans la connaissance et l'exploration de l'océan glacial arctique. «
请听，开启我们的视野。请听，给我们力量。请听，可以改变一切。英国宝城人寿。
为了健康，有人习惯流汗运动，也有人寻求减压放松。但是你可能不知道，全球上千万的运动爱好者都使用乔山、江神所设计制造的健身器材。日本第一的 Panasonic 按摩仪和 Fuji 也唯有乔山负责行销。除非你不在意健康，否则从今天起，你一定要认识乔山。乔山健康科技，江神。
先生，你知道保持距离吧？
小姐，是你靠过来的。
天快黑了，快找保险公司来吧。
他们会来吗？
我的心安就会来啊。
别担心，新安东京海上不分日夜，24小时服务，不打烊。
哇，好快哦！
协助解决您的问题。
新安东京海上就是比较好。
Set up in 1920, Scammell's lorries led the world, literally the world, as their machines weren't designed just to run on the smooth, civilized roads of the mother country.
In the form of this giant six-wheeled Pioneer model, Scammell's worked brilliantly in the jungles and deserts of the Empire too. Their great off-road capability enabling them to carry huge loads absolutely anywhere.
Even by today's standards, the Pioneer's go-anywhere performance was brilliant. But back in the 1920s, it was stratospheric. This is a huge lorry, for goodness sake. How crazy is that?
Scammell's chief designer, Oliver North, had made the concept of a go-anywhere lorry possible by inventing a world-beating suspension system in 1927. Effectively, a seesaw with wheels at either end that lets the wheels move up and down as much as 4 feet, so they're always in contact with the ground. It was so far ahead of its time, it was produced right up to the end of World War II, where the Pioneer was used as a tank transporter.
The Pioneer doesn't do speed, but what it does do in abundance is unstoppability. It really is absolutely magnificent. It's a huge hulk of a machine, but the power and the reassuring beat of that giant engine in front of you is just intoxicating. Whilst all that power doesn't just go to 2 wheels like it did with most lorries of the day, it goes to 4, which means that if one of your wheels gets stuck in the rough, you've still got 3 more to drive you along. What you do have to watch is the kickback from the steering wheel if you reach a piece of undulating ground. On a certain amount of, it'll do its own thing. And if you come across a very sharp undulation, it will kick back at you and it could take your fingers off, which wouldn't be very nice. When it comes to off-roaders, this is the king. What a beast.
The giant lorry was employed all over the British Empire, perfect for hauling logs out of jungles and forests where roads were few and far between.
But the role that made the Pioneer truly great took it to the Empire's deserts, where it was instrumental in forging the world we know today.
At the beginning of the 1920s, thanks partly to one Colonel Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, Britain found herself controlling over 50% of all the world's oil fields, her biggest being in Iran and Iraq. But that oil was untapped, underground. Whilst back in Britain, petrol was still in such short supply following World War I that it was rationed up to 1919, and often just sold in tins from the chemist. For petrol engines to become the hub of everyday life as they are today, a lot of new oil would have to flow into Britain and the world. And that's why the Pioneer found itself in the desert. Its unique off-road capability made it the perfect workhorse for pipeline laying.
Building a pipeline isn't as straightforward as you might think. It was 628 miles from Britain's biggest Kirkuk oil field in Iraq to her tankers waiting on the Mediterranean coast.
Meaning 84,000 pipes had to be hauled by the Scammells, off-road across the desert, ready to be connected together.
The last 55 miles presented the biggest challenge because it ran steeply downhill from the 2,000-foot-high Arabian plateau all the way to the sea.
For the oil inside the pipes, it would be like going down the Cresta Run, making it utterly uncontrollable when it reached the other end. To solve it, the pioneers had to climb to the top of the plateau with 670 specially made narrow pipes.
Which, when laid down the steepest part of the hill, acted like closing off 2 lanes of a 3-lane motorway, slowing the traffic of oil down so it could be safely loaded onto the tankers.
It was a very ingenious use of a bottleneck. The great Scammell Pioneer played a central role in opening up the Middle East's oil fields. But as more and more of the world's oil flowed into Britain, another problem reared its head. How to get all that oil, or rather the petrol made from it, into the hands of the eager motorist. Chemists and tins could no longer cope, which is why an institution we now take completely for granted as having always been there was born. The garage forecourt with petrol pumps.
This is one of those very early petrol pumps. She's a Gilbert & Barker T8, known lovingly to motorists of the day as the Fat Lady. She's a sturdy affair, cast iron and over 7 feet tall.
Up front in her ample bosom, she's got 2 iron doors hiding her pumping mechanism, which consists of a hand pump connected to an underground tank.
The attendant had to be fairly dexterous, turning the handle at the rear here, while at the same time craning around to read the dial. There we go, one of those, and then again. I like this fat lady. The fat lady stopped singing.
Fat ladies sprang up all over the place, outside cafes, shops, and even pubs, supplying an ever-growing horde of motor vehicles. But as the demand for petrol went through the roof, another problem reared its head.
How on earth do you safely transport it in bulk to the petrol stations?
A problem solved once again by Scammell.
Transporting liquids is an absolute nightmare. As soon as you move off, they start to slosh around. The more you stop, start, and go around corners, the more they slosh.
Until at some point, they form a bloody great wave. And that wave would be enough to tip your lorry over unless it was massively heavy, only leaving you with enough power to carry a small amount of liquid.
Luckily, the boffins at Scammell came up with a solution. And this is it.
The Scammell frameless tanker. Sadly, there seem to be no 1920s petrol ones left. But what makes this machine great is that ever since Scammell built their first one in 1926, whether you were transporting bitumen, petrol, or any other fluid, this became the shape of bulk liquid transporters worldwide, right up to today. Inside, many had lots and lots of separate compartments, so any waves that formed could only travel a small way and never gather enough energy to tip you over. Whilst outside, there's no frame. On Scammell's tankers, the wheels simply bolt onto the heavy tank, minimizing overall weight and maximizing the liquid you can carry. Genius! Another great British invention.
Okay, so we're coming up to a bend. Let's see how the Scammell and our liquid load cope with it. Well, it's no longer going horribly wrong in my fish tank. It's got lots of compartments, you see, just like Scammell's tankers. Look, not a sloshy wave in sight.
By the end of the 20s, Scammell's tankers were helping supply the 60,000 petrol stations that had sprung up from nothing in the space of just 10 years. The petrol-centered world we know today was forming. And all manner of machines were now stopping for fuel, from charabancs to chauffeur-driven Bentleys. But mostly, they supplied motorcycles. Britain's motorcycle industry had absolutely boomed during the 20s, with 1/3 of all the world's motorbikes being found on Britain's roads. But there were motorbikes, and there were motorbikes. Very superior motorbikes. Lawrence of Arabia loved his Brough Superior, describing it as skittish with a touch of blood in it. But what was a Brough Superior?
In the 1920s, it was the fastest, most reliable, most expensive motorcycle in the world. That's all.
It would cost you the same as half a 1920s house. And just like Britain's other great speed machine, the Bentley, it was developed here, on the banked circuit at Brooklands, where it held the lap record right up until World War II, and ultimately, in Hungary, took the world bike speed record to 169.68 miles an hour. The Brough's 1000cc overhead valve state-of-the-art racing engine was so powerful, the frame had to have extra bracing struts to stop it bending when the bike accelerated. Each one was tested to over 100 miles an hour around Brooklands before it was allowed to go to its new owner. The world loved them, and so do I.
But nobody loved them more than Lawrence of Arabia. He had 4 SS100s, one after the other.
Lawrence's success in Arabia had made him an A-list celebrity. But he hated being hounded by the press. and by the mid-20s had changed his name and joined the Air Force simply as Aircraftman T.E. Shaw. He loathed fame, but he loved speed, and nothing gave him greater pleasure than racing his Brough at breakneck speed through the countryside after work. Nothing could catch him until one evening, another speed machine appeared overhead. In his memoirs, he tells of what happened next. The pilot pointed down the road towards Lincoln. I sat hard in the saddle, folded back my ears, and went away after him like a dog after a hare. Through the plunges of the next 10 seconds, I clung on, wedging my gloved hand on the throttle lever so that no bump should close it and spoil our speed.
Then the bicycle wrenched sideways into 3 long ruts. It swayed dizzily, wagging its tail for 30 awful yards.
The bad ground was past, and on the new road our flight became bird-like. We seemed to whirl soundlessly between the sun-gilt stubble fields.
And I dared on a rise to slow imperceptibly and glance sideways into the sky.
There the fighter was, 200 yards and more back. I slowed to 90, signaled with my hand for him to overtake. Over he rattled. His passenger, a helmeted and goggled grin, hung out of the cockpit to pass me. RAF Randy greeting.
国家地理频道决战10点，每星期3报告狗班长。西萨教官让我们对宝贝宠物不再束手无策。明晚10点，国家地理频道。
环四海，跨五洲，大网络来覆盖，这就是物流。合伙办公，携手让成就变全球，这就是物流。科技赢在前，无阻碍全实现，这就是物流。好生意大作为 UPS 来帮你，这就是物流。
中华电信网内免费自由选，通话量大就加入自由打，网内通通免费。情侣哈拉就选我的热线，打2000分钟热线免费，全部免绑约，享受自由。门槛低，免搭上网费率，新旧客户都可办，免费打选中华，超自由。
行动触动真感动 ，Keep in touch。
中华电信，千锤百炼，专注顶尖。ESSEN 新一代顶级规格国光牌赛车级 ESSEN 全合成车用机油，爆发极限能量，展现超凡原动力。跃升奔驰新境界，成就爱车巅峰状态。国光牌赛车级 ESSEN 机油，中油直营加油站贩售中。
安尼是。潘老师，你好，你好。
气色很好哦。
肝好，身体好，气色当然嘛好。
喝台糖险金哦。
对，唯一1天1罐就有效。
台糖险金通过国家双认证，是最有效的险金。
护肝，增强战斗力，
抗疲劳才有续航力。
1天1罐，
活力不断。
台糖险金。
阿哥你串，你爱啉无？
体力更上一层楼。
我终于了解，生命里最可贵的，竟是些最简单的事。守护你的幸福人生。
请关心末梢血液循环问题，循利宁滴剂，德国舒培大药厂。
请听，开启我们的视野。请听，给我们力量。请听，可以改变一切。英国宝城人寿。
一早起来总觉得睡不饱，没元气；到了晚上想加班却没精力。
全新白兰氏续配人参浅精，人参加黄金蚬，补元气、补精力，双补双保护，健康更牢固。白兰氏续配人参浅精新上市。
The aircraft might have lost to Lawrence that day in 1926, but the 1920s as a whole were a great time for British flying machines.
And none more so than for this one, the de Havilland Gypsy Moth, which, like the Bruff Superior, was a machine made truly great by its engine.
But not because it was complex or state-of-the-art, because it's not. And that's the point. Its designer, Geoffrey de Havilland, made sure the Moth's engine was so simple, any budding pilot could maintain it himself. Originally, he just used scrap World War I engines, finished off with car parts. But when they started running out of scrap in 1926, de Havilland's engineer Frank Halford built these brand new but equally simple Gypsy 1 engines to put in their place. The airframe, on the other hand, or rather the wings, were anything but simple. Just like the engine, though, they made the Gypsy Moth incredibly practical.
Because look, if I pull this pin here, the wings will actually fold back. Meaning you didn't need a huge hangar for this aircraft. You could keep it in your garage.
Overnight, this great British machine had made aviation as simple as running a family car. Indeed, you could use it as the family car. Look, it's even got a boot, especially designed to be big enough to take the golf clubs. It would cost a bit more than the average car, though, £750, the equivalent of £34,000 in today's money. Expensive, but very cheap for a plane. Those who could afford it flocked to buy it, including the Prince of Wales, who used his to fly to golfing matches, landing on the fairways. But the people who bought most of them were the Royal Aero Club, a national institution who were in the process of setting up flying schools all over the country. Flying schools for which the easy-to-maintain, easy-to-store Moth was perfect. They bought so many that by the end of the 20s, 85 out of every 100 aircraft in Britain was a Moth. Aero Club lessons cost £1 10 shillings a pop, about 60 quid in today's money. Now, it was said that this aircraft was so easy to fly, it only took 8 lessons to get your license. Let's just see how true that was, shall we? This is Nigel Reed. He's going to try and teach me the 1920s basics.
Away we go. The tail will drop the ground. We are now flying. We're up in the Gypsy Moth. Beautiful. Absolutely tremendous sight. The green fields down below. We've just taken off from a field. Absolutely amazing. You could do that in one of these. Fantastic. Did you want to fly the aeroplane? Yeah, if I could ever go and take in the stick, if you allowed that. Yeah, that's right. When I say you have control, you say I have control, so I know you're flying the aeroplane. I have control. So if you like to ease the stick to the left.
I'm just applying a bit of pressure to the control stick, and already the Moth's rolling gently to the left.
That's lovely. If you like to roll the wings level.
It's amazing just how forgiving and simple this thing is to fly.
Oh, oh, oh. Still going to turn, man. Still going to shroud. Beautiful, well done. Just momentarily, I feel I'm flying this machine. It's quite exciting. I have to say, it's at moments like this, I think to myself, that private pilot's license would be a good thing to have.
Unbelievably, in the 1920s, a solo lap of the airfield was pretty much all you had to do to get your flying license. That, and one other thing. Engine failure was a very common event back in the 20s, so in your test, you had to switch off your engine to simulate engine failure and show you could glide down and land in a little circle on the grass. One of the things that made the Moth great was that if the engine did fail, it was very easy to repair, which meant it wasn't just the machine of choice for the 1920s flying schools, but also for the aerial explorer.
A new breed of aviator who needed an aircraft that you could crash land in a jungle or a desert and get going again with a blow of a hammer and a bit of strength.
People like Mary Bailey, who learned to fly in a Moth, then promptly flew it to South Africa and back via the Congo and the Sahara. Amy Johnson, who flew hers to Australia. And forerunner of them all, de Havilland's chief test pilot, Alan Cobham.
In May 1925, Cobham flew the first Moth ever made to Zurich and back in a single day, just to show what the aircraft was capable of.
Then in November, he set out in the Moth's forerunner, the de Havilland 50, to try to find commercial air routes to the far-flung corners of the British Empire. Places that in many cases had never seen a plane before. Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Australia. He created routes to them all, and was immediately knighted on his return in 1926 when he landed on the Thames in front of 1 million cheering fans.
Cobham and his Moth-flying successors, like Amy Johnson, were the pathfinders of modern air travel.
Within just a few years of Cobham's flights, international airlines like Britain's Imperial Airways were following in his footsteps, flying what have gone on to become the long-haul air routes we now take completely for granted. "Fly there," read the Imperial Airways advertising poster, and helped by Geoffrey de Havilland's little pioneering aeroplanes, we now can. The new airliners would mean a lot more business for the rapidly expanding oil industry, but they weren't going to have it all their own way. They had competition from machines the Germans had perfected during World War I. Machines that relied on hydrogen rather than petrol to keep them aloft. And machines which, unlike the new airliners that only had a very short range, could stay airborne for days, crossing oceans and continents, whilst carrying 10 times the passengers of any aeroplane in infinitely greater comfort. Airships. They seemed the perfect vehicles for linking the vastness of the British Empire. So in the 1920s, Britain began building passenger airships of her own. The biggest of all taking shape in this immense 800-foot-long hangar at Cardington, the R101. Here, 27 miles of steel were being attached to 136 feet high, 30-sided polygons to create a hollow steel cigar the length of 2 football pitches. A cigar the 700-strong workforce were filling with 16 giant gas bags, each one having more volume than 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It was to be the largest flying machine in the world.
The R101 was so big, it only just fitted in this enormous space. There were literally only a few feet to spare. So how could something that big possibly fly? And how did you drive it? Let me show you. Inside my airship, just as in the R101, are 16 gas bags filled with hydrogen.
Just enough hydrogen to lift the airship off the ground and hover. No more than that. It's effectively weightless, like a ship floating on the sea.
And just like a ship, if you give it a push, it'll head off in the direction you're pushing it in. Which is where the R101's giant engines came in, pushing the ship along.
Unlike the sea, though, the air's three-dimensional. So to let the R101 go up and down, it had giant steel fins, each the length of 3 gypsy moths, fitted to its stern. Move the fins, and behaving just like a submarine, it'll rise and fall.
But it's much more complicated than an airborne submarine, because the hydrogen inside misbehaves.
As it heats up in the sunlight, it makes the nose or tail go up and down all by themselves.
All of which meant that the utterly enormous R101 was as complicated to drive as it was to build.
It needed a massive crew of 42, just like a huge ship. And the similarities with a huge ship didn't stop there. Look at what they were building on the inside.
Welcome to the lounge, complete with tables and chairs, a writing desk, and some paintings on the walls. Go up those steps and through that door, you'll find yourself on one of the promenade decks where you can relax on a deck chair while you watch the world drift by below you through these massive windows.
These stunning rooms were one of the things that made the R101 great. No aeroplane or indeed airship had anything like it, and the accommodation didn't stop there. Unbelievably, for a machine full of hydrogen, there was even a smoking room. Yes, a smoking room. Passengers could retire here after dinner for a leisurely cigar, safe in the knowledge that the floor was covered in steel and the roof lined with asbestos.
Which was handy, because when hydrogen and flames mix, this happens. And there was an awful lot of hydrogen on board this ship.
Enough to fill 52 Olympic swimming pools. So how did airships get their hands on that much? Were the 20s, as well as developing roadside petrol pumps, developing airside hydrogen pumps too? Well, actually they were. Very big hydrogen pumps, fed by gas plants, at airship refueling stations all over the British Empire. Cardington's hydrogen plant, now in ruins, was on the hill next to it, with an array of pipes running down under the walls into the shed, ready to fill and lift the giant airship.
But even going at full chat, it still took 19 days for the hydrogen from the plant going through these pipes to fill R101.
It was only then, in 1929, that the boffins, who'd been building the airship in here for 3 years, suddenly realized they had a problem. A very big problem.
造之神日商大连锁集团与日商华大城、台湾引建龙头新复发集团联合打造台湾最大住宅工程，3000平宫顶花园，7000平富豪领地，80到120平国王的城堡、皇后的花园，林口新都心世界首席，2630-5588。
一个转身，发现3000平维也纳森林；一个仰望，看见艺术天使的桂冠；一个回眸，漫步在百米香榭大道。在世界首席，生活也可以像一则神话。
国王的城堡，
皇后的花园，
林口新都心世界首席，2630-5588。
除非你不在意健康，否则从今天起，你一定要认识乔山。乔山健康科技，江神。
采用青藏高原天然冬虫夏草，白兰氏冬虫夏草基金，让你精气神自然好。千锤百炼，专注顶尖。ESSEN 新一代顶级规格国光牌赛车级 ESSEN 全合成车用机油，爆发极限能量，展现超凡原动力，跃升奔驰新境界，成就爱车巅峰状态。国光牌赛车级 ESSEN 机油，中油直营加油站贩售中。
你不断重复擦药治疗香港脚吗？疗霉舒一次疗程，擦一次能形成薄膜，让药效持续作用，杀死霉菌。疗霉舒一次疗程，擦一次有效治疗香港脚。
先生，你知道保持距离吧？
小姐，是你靠过来的。
天快黑了，快找保险公司来吧。
他们会来吗？
我的心安就会来啊。
别担心，新安东京海上不分日夜，24小时服务，不打烊。
哇，好快哦！
协助解决您的问题。
新安东京海上就是比较好。
Infinity FX.
Infinity
FX V-Spec launch.
2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center.
国家地理频道将以91110周年纪念专题回顾及审思事件发生的过程。
After about 6 months, I had to kind of say, okay, somebody please help me.
We did not know what was going on. We never could figure it out.
The truth of that day is that the national command structure was irrelevant.
国家地理频道全球独家前美国总统布希对911事件的看法。91110周年纪念，接下来在国家地理频道播出。
When the R101 was inflated with hydrogen, it was found to be massively overweight. To get her into the air at all, her gas bags had to be inflated so much they rubbed against the steel cigar frame. And even then, on her test flights, she could only just stay in the air, not helped by numerous leaks and her outer cover repeatedly tearing. R101 had gone from being a great piece of British engineering to a great big accident waiting to happen. There was only one thing for it. Drag her back into the giant shed, cut her in half, add 45 more feet, and another 4 Olympic swimming pools worth of gas bag, and replace the entire cover. After working flat out for 2 months, so she'd be ready for her first commercial flight as advertised, the work was completed in September 1930. And the biggest flying machine in the world, now a staggering 777 feet long, was pulled back out of the shed by 400 workers. On the 4th of October, she took off with 54 people on board, heading for India. She followed the same aerial route as I am, crossing the channel at Hastings.
At around 2 a.m., she flew into heavy rain, and things started to go horribly wrong.
It seems the old cover on the front end of the airship hadn't been fully replaced, leading to it ripping away, with the rain then soaking the gas bags beneath. This would have caused the hydrogen to cool down, reducing the lift in the airship's nose, resulting in a steep, slow dive.
The 42 crew desperately tried to get her level again, but at 8 minutes past 2, she ploughed into the ground. Just down there, Beauvais in France.
Her hydrogen ignited, and she blew up, killing 48 of the 54 people on board. Britain's airship program was cancelled immediately, with her remaining airships broken up for scrap. A few years later, with the tragic destruction of Germany's Hindenburg, the rest of the world gave up on airships too. Their great range, passenger capacity, and comfort simply outweighed by their vulnerability to fiery disaster. And with their demise, hydrogen ceased to be a major fuel for the 20th century, leaving petrol to reign supreme. Nowhere more so than at a racing circuit 130 miles from where the R101 crashed.
Le Mans 1930, where W.O. Bentley's cars were once again coming in first and second. But this was to be their swan song.
Because with the end of the 20s came the biggest economic crash the world had ever seen. And with it, the 10-year party of roaring machines, dancing queens, and adventurous dreams came to an abrupt end, leaving a very nasty hangover. Many of the cutting-edge, high-tech companies founded at the start of the decade simply went to the wall.
Bentley Motors were one of them, bankrupt by 1931. Sadly, many of the people who created the Roaring Twenties went the same way.
Just a year after his 1930 victory at Le Mans, Bentley driver Glenn Kidston was killed when his de Havilland Moth broke up over Africa. Clive Dunphy, another of WO's Le Mans drivers, died when his Bentley went over the banking at Brooklands in 1932. And in 1935, Lawrence of Arabia was fatally injured at the controls of his beloved Brough Superior when he swerved to avoid a boy on a bicycle.
These great British pioneers, however, did leave a legacy.
The machines and infrastructures they forged in the engine-roaring 1920s formed the very foundations of the modern, petrol-centered world we know today. Petrol and petrol heads were here to stay.
关键8点，接下来在国家地理频道播出。国家地理频道最值得一看的深度观察，最包罗万象的精彩主题，就在每晚10点。每个星期一细说中国，星期二调查事件部，星期三报告狗班长，星期四科学新一点，还有星期五好耶！严选的精彩内容都在决战10点，您千万不能错过。今晚10点，国家地理频道。当数以百万计的人看到这难以想象的景象摊开在眼前时，有一个人独自站在风暴的中心。前美国总统布希首度将他个人对911事件每一个片刻做出完整的描述， 在91110周年纪念，国家地理频道独家专访前美国总统布希。91110周年纪念，小布希独家专访，星期四晚上8点，国家地理。